Hello and welcome back to the William Gomez podcast. I am William Gomez and I am grateful to have you here. Today we explore one of the most significant ideas in Lacanian psychoanalysis, something he called the symbolic order. If the imaginary is the realm of images, identifications, and reflections, the symbolic is the world of language, rules, and social structure. It is the dimension that gives meaning to our experience and shapes our identity in profound ways. In this episode, we will take our time with this concept, unpacking what it is, how it forms, and why it influences almost everything in human life, from our relationships to our desires and our sense of self. To understand the symbolic, let us begin with something simple. Imagine a young child who has been living in a world of sensations. They recognize faces, they respond to gestures, and they feel their body through movement and sensation. They have an imaginary relationship with themselves shaped by images and impressions. But then something changes. The child begins to understand and use words. They enter the world of language, and this changes everything. Language is not just a tool, it is a structure. It gives names to people, objects, feelings, and roles. The moment the child learns to say I and you, mine and yours, they enter into a network of meanings that existed long before they were born. The symbolic order is this network. It is the structure of signs and rules that organizes reality. It shapes how we understand time, how we relate to authority, and how we interpret our place in the world. The symbolic is not only about speaking, it is about being spoken into a system that assigns roles and expectations. When a child is given a name, that name becomes part of their identity. It becomes the signifier that anchors them in the social world. Once named, the child is woven into a family, a culture, and a history. The symbolic gives them a place. This means that the symbolic is bigger than the individual. It includes the rules that govern relationships, the traditions passed down through generations, and the social norms that shape behavior. The symbolic tells us what a parent is, what a child is, and what each of them should do. It tells us what it means to be a friend, a partner, a citizen, or a student. Thus, roles are not invented on the spot. They are part of a structure that existed long before any of us arrived. One of the most important aspects of the symbolic is that it creates limits. Language not only allows us to express ourselves, it also restricts us. When we put something into words, we give it shape, but we also reduce its complexity. Feelings that were once expansive become narrower in language. This is not a flaw, it is part of how the symbolic works. It organizes life, but it does so by drawing boundaries. Another way to understand the symbolic is through the idea of law. Law here does not mean legal codes or courtrooms. It refers to the basic rules that make relationship possible. The symbolic law is what separates roles, regulates desire, and creates structure in human life. It tells us what is allowed, what is forbidden, and what is expected. Even simple family structures are shaped by this symbolic law. A child understands that one person occupies the position of mother, another occupies the position of father, and that these positions carry meaning. These meanings are symbolic. They exist because language assigns them. In the symbolic, meaning is relational. A word means something not because of what it is, but because of how it relates to other words. In the same way, identity takes shape through differences. A person understands who they are partly by knowing who they are not. This relational structure shapes how we see ourselves. The symbolic introduces us to the fact that identity is not fixed. It shifts as we move through different roles in different context. The symbolic also shapes desire. When the child enters language, their desires become organized in new ways. They learn to express what they want, but they also learn to adjust their desires to the expectations of others. The symbolic tells them what is possible, what is allowed, and what must remain unspoken. Because the symbolic introduces rules and prohibitions, it also creates longing. The child learns that some things cannot be said or cannot be asked for. These prohibitions shape the movement of desire. The symbolic also reshapes the imaginary. Once the child has language, the images from the imaginary begin to be named, interpreted, and categorized. The self image that formed in the mirror stage becomes linked to words. These words create a story about who the person is. The imaginary gives the ego its shape. The symbolic gives the ego its narrative. Together, they create the everyday sense of self. Let us think about how the symbolic influences relationships. When two people speak to each other, they do not communicate only as individuals. They communicate through the symbolic. They speak using words that carry shared meanings. They use signs that reflect cultural norms. When someone says, I love you, the meaning of that phrase is shaped by the symbolic order they both inhabit. The words come with expectations, fears, hopes, and histories that neither person invented alone. The symbolic also plays a role in shaping conflict. When someone feels misunderstood, it is often because the symbolic meaning of their words does not match what they intended to express. The symbolic can fail us. Language can fail to capture the depth of what we feel. This is why people sometimes say, I don't have the words. The symbolic gives meaning, but it also has limits. There are parts of experience that resist being fully symbolized. This resistance leads us into what Lacan called the real, which we will explore in a future episode. Another important function of the symbolic is structuring time. Language gives us past, present, and future. It allows us to tell stories about where we have been and where we are going. Without language, time would be a series of sensations. With language, life becomes a narrative. We place ourselves within that narrative and see our life as a journey. The symbolic opens this dimension for us. It is worth noting that the symbolic is not something we choose, it is something we inherit. We learn the language of our family, the customs of our culture, and the rules of our society long before we are aware of them. They shape us quietly. They guide our expectations of others and our expectations of ourselves. Only later in life do we realize how deeply the symbolic has shaped our identity. As we grow older, we sometimes confront the gaps between our imaginary image and our symbolic identity. The imaginary gives us an idealized picture of who we want to be. The symbolic tells us who we are allowed to be. These two forces can sometimes conflict. Someone may imagine themselves as free and spontaneous, but the symbolic places them in a role that demands responsibility. Someone may imagine themselves as strong, but the symbolic may impose circumstances in which they feel vulnerable. These tensions are part of the human experience. Understanding the symbolic can help us navigate these tensions with more clarity. When we realize that many of our struggles come from trying to reconcile our imaginary images with symbolic expectations, we can approach ourselves with more kindness. We can recognize that the pressure to fit into certain roles is not a sign of personal failure, it is part of being human. The symbolic shapes desire, identity, and behavior in ways we cannot escape, but we can learn to work within it more consciously. The symbolic also invites us to reflect on the words we use to describe ourselves and others. Words carry weight. They create the categories through which we understand the world. When we choose our words carefully, we shape our reality more thoughtfully. When we listen to the words others use, we understand their experience more deeply. As we close today's episode, let us remember that the symbolic is not something to fear. It is part of the structure that makes human life possible. It gives meaning to our relationships. It allows us to express our inner world and to understand the inner world of others. It allows us to tell stories, make commitments, and imagine futures. It is the foundation for communication and connection. In our next episode, we will move toward the third dimension of Lacanian theory, the real. The real is the part of experience that resists language and escapes symbolization. It is the place where meaning fails and where the limits of the symbolic become visible. But for now, I hope this episode helps you understand how deeply language shapes us, how it structures desire, and how it gives form to the stories we tell about our lives. Thank you for listening. This is the William Gomes podcast. Take care of yourself, stay curious, and I will speak with you again soon.